What if everything you learned in school was carefully edited? Not wrong exactly, just incomplete. Like someone went through your textbook with a very precise pair of scissors and removed the chapters that made the government look a little too human, a little too fallible, a little too willing to do whatever it took to maintain power, win wars, or simply avoid embarrassment. Your teachers weren't lying to you, but they were working from a curriculum that someone else designed. And the people who designed that curriculum had opinions about what a 16-year-old sitting in third period history class really needed to know. Spoiler alert, it wasn't this. Because while you were memorizing dates and capitals and the causes of wars you'd never fully understand, there were filing cabinets in government buildings packed with documents that told a very different story. Programs that ran for decades. Experiments on people who had no idea they were subjects. Secret deals, staged events, and classified operations that shaped the world you're living in right now. Not ancient history, not another country. This country. Your government. Your history. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night, which feels appropriate given that you're probably listening to this while you're trying to sleep. Most of these stories didn't stay hidden because the evidence was destroyed. Some of it was, sure, but a lot of it was just sitting there. In congressional records. In declassified CIA files. In court documents from lawsuits that settled quietly while the news cycle moved on. The information was technically available, it just wasn't being taught. So tonight, we're going to change that. What you're about to hear is not speculation. It's not the kind of thing that lives in comment sections or gets forwarded with 17 exclamation points. These are documented, verified, sourced events that were buried, classified, minimized, or simply never made it into the version of American history that got taught between the bell and lunch break. Some of them were hidden for decades before whistleblowers or investigative journalists or court orders pulled them into the light. Some of them have been quietly acknowledged by the very institutions that carried them out. And some of them are still, even now, only partially declassified. We're talking about medical experiments on people who thought they were getting help. We're talking about government programs that monitored, infiltrated, and actively destroyed the lives of ordinary citizens. We're talking about wars started on false pretenses, alliances made with people your textbook called the enemy, and economic decisions that killed thousands of people while officials called it policy. We're talking about things that happened in hospitals and prisons and living rooms in city streets, things that happened to real people with real names and real families who deserve to know the truth. And before we get into all of that, do me a favor. If you're new here, subscribe, hit the like button. I know that sounds like the thing every YouTuber says before the interesting part, but dark history doesn't exactly get promoted. YouTube's algorithm tends to prefer things that are a little more cheerful, a little less classified. So if you want more content like this, the subscribe button is how you make that happen. It tells the algorithm that someone out there actually wants to know what's in the parts of history that got quietly edited out. Now, get comfortable. If you're lying down, stay there. If you've got the lights low and something warm to drink, even better. This video is designed for that specific kind of late night attention. The kind you give things when the rest of the world has gone quiet and your mind is finally ready to actually absorb what it's hearing. Because the 99 things you're about to hear deserve that kind of attention. Not panic, not outrage, though some of that is probably unavoidable. Just calm, clear, unflinching attention. The kind your history teacher could have used a little more of. Each entry is real. Each one was documented, and each one represents a chapter of American history that someone somewhere decided you didn't need to know about. A story that got removed, redacted, reclassified, or simply never included in the first place. And when you add them all together, they don't paint a picture of a uniquely evil country. They paint a picture of power doing what power has always done throughout history, protecting itself, justifying itself, and counting on the fact that most people will never go looking for the version they weren't supposed to find. Tonight, you're going looking 99 items, 99 stories that were quietly removed from your education. Some of them will make you furious. Some of them will make you sad. Some of them will make you genuinely wonder how any of this stayed hidden as long as it did. And some of them, the strangest ones, the ones that sound the most impossible, those are the ones where you can look up the primary source yourself tomorrow morning and confirm every single word. So let's begin. Let's go back to the parts of history that never made it into your textbook, and let's read the chapters they cut. 1. The Ludlow Massacre. In 1914, striking coal miners in Colorado were living in a tent colony with their families because they'd been evicted from company housing when they walked off the job. They were striking against Rockefeller-owned Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, asking for safer conditions, better pay, and the right to be paid in actual money instead of company scrip. On April 20th, the Colorado National Guard and company guards opened fire on the tent colony with machine guns. Then they soaked the tents in kerosene and lit them on fire. 2 women and 11 children were found suffocated in a pit beneath one of the burned tents where they'd been hiding. At least 25 people died that day, including those 13 who never made it out of the ground. The Rockefeller family hired a public relations expert named Ivy Lee to manage the story. It worked. You probably never heard of Ludlow, but you've definitely heard of the Rockefellers. 2. The Wilmington Coup of 1898. This is the only successful armed overthrow of a sitting government in American history, and it happened in North Carolina, not some distant country. Wilmington in 1898 had a functioning multiracial democratic government. Black citizens held elected office. The city was prosperous. White supremacist Democrats, furious that black men had political power, organized a mob of over 2,000 armed men. They burned down the black-owned newspaper, marched through the streets, killed an unknown number of black residents, and physically removed the elected mayor and city council from office at gunpoint. Then they installed themselves. The official death count was listed as somewhere between 14 and 60, though historians believe it was far higher. No one was ever charged. The coup was described in newspapers at the time as restoring order. The men who led it went on to serve as governor and senator. This event was not listed in most American history textbooks for over a century. 3. The Tulsa Race Massacre. In 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma had a neighborhood called Greenwood, known as Black Wall Street. It was one of the wealthiest black communities in the country, full of doctors, lawyers, hotels, theaters, and businesses. On May 31st, a white mob descended on Greenwood after a black teenager named Dick Rowland was accused of assaulting a white elevator operator. The charges were almost certainly false. The mob didn't care. They burned 35 blocks to the ground. They shot residents in the streets. And here's the part that really doesn't make the textbooks. Private planes flew over Greenwood shooting at residents and dropping incendiary devices. The official death toll was listed at 36. Modern historians estimate it was likely between 100 and 300 people. Over 10,000 black residents were left homeless. The survivors were told to forget it happened. For decades, most of Oklahoma did exactly that. 4. The Ocoee Election Day Massacre. On November 2, 1920, a black man named July Perry tried to vote in Ocoee, Florida. This was legal. The 15th Amendment had guaranteed black men the right to vote for 50 years. But in Ocoee, a white mob decided to enforce a different rule. Perry was shot and lynched. Then the mob turned on the entire black community. They burned homes, a church, and a lodge. They drove every black resident out of town. The official death count was 2. Eyewitness accounts and later historical research suggest it was significantly higher, with bodies buried in unmarked graves and thrown into nearby lakes. The black community of Ocoee simply ceased to exist after that day. The town remained all white for decades. It was an election day massacre designed to send a message to every black voter in Florida, and it worked exactly as intended. 5. The Colfax Massacre. In 1873, following a disputed Louisiana gubernatorial election, a group of black men and Republican militia members occupied the Colfax courthouse to protect the election results. On Easter Sunday, a white paramilitary group called the White League attacked. Around 150 black men were killed, many of them after they had already surrendered and were being held as prisoners. The men who carried out the massacre were eventually charged under federal civil rights law. The case went to the Supreme Court as United States v. Cruikshank, and the court essentially ruled that the federal government couldn't protect black citizens from private violence. The men were freed. The ruling gutted the 14th Amendment's protections for decades. The Colfax Massacre didn't just kill over 100 people. It dismantled the legal framework meant to protect black Americans during Reconstruction. A marker at the site once called it a riot in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. That marker stood for decades. 6. The Elaine Massacre. In 1919, black sharecroppers in Elaine, Arkansas were doing something radical. They were organizing a union to negotiate better cotton prices. Their union meetings were attacked by white men. A gunfight broke out. A white man was killed. That was all the justification anyone needed. White mobs, and eventually federal troops descended on the black community of Elaine. The death toll for black residents is estimated between 100 and 237 people. 5 white men were also killed. 12 black men were sentenced to death. Hundreds more were imprisoned. A committee of white citizens later published a report claiming there had been a black conspiracy to massacre white people. There was no such conspiracy. There were sharecroppers who wanted to be paid fairly. The massacre was the response to that request, and the federal government sent soldiers not to protect the sharecroppers but to help end the so-called insurrection. 7. The Rosewood Massacre. In January 1923, a white woman in Sumner, Florida claimed she had been assaulted by a black man. A white mob formed and turned its attention to the nearby all-black town of Rosewood. Over the course of a week, they burned every building in town, hunted residents through the surrounding swamps, and killed an unknown number of people. The official count was 8. Survivors and historians put it higher. The remaining residents fled and never returned. Rosewood ceased to exist. The state of Florida knew what happened and did nothing. No one was ever charged. The survivors didn't talk about it publicly for decades because they were afraid, because they had seen what happened when black communities prospered, and then the wrong person told the wrong lie. Florida finally acknowledged the massacre in 1994, 71 years later, and offered survivor compensation. By then, most survivors were gone, and the massacres didn't stop with black communities. Chinese immigrants in America were also targets of coordinated, organized, murderous violence that your textbook treated like it never happened. 8. The Chinese Massacre of 1871. On the night of October 24, 1871, a mob of around 500 people descended on Los Angeles' Chinatown. They dragged Chinese residents from their homes, shot them in the streets, and hanged them from wagon wheels and awnings. 19 Chinese men and boys were killed that night, making it one of the largest mass lynchings in American history. The violence started after a white man was accidentally shot during a dispute between 2 Chinese factions, and the mob used it as an excuse. The victims were robbed while they were being murdered. Thieves literally picked through their pockets and pulled rings off their fingers as they hanged. 8 men were eventually convicted. All convictions were overturned on a technicality within 2 years. Nobody served time. The city of Los Angeles had just committed a mass atrocity, and the legal system responded by shrugging. The event was buried so completely that most Californians have never heard of it. 9. The Rock Springs Massacre. On September 2, 1885, white coal miners in Rock Springs, Wyoming decided they were tired of working alongside Chinese co-workers. The Chinese miners had been hired by the Union Pacific Railroad because they worked for less. The white miners didn't direct their anger at the railroad that was exploiting everyone. They directed it at the Chinese men. The mob moved through Chinatown with rifles, shooting residents and setting fire to homes and businesses. 28 Chinese miners were killed. 15 more were wounded. The entire Chinese community, around 500 people, was driven out of town at gunpoint. Their homes and belongings burned behind them. The federal government sent troops, not to prosecute the killers, but to restore order so the mines could reopen. The Chinese laborers were eventually returned to work. The white miners who murdered their coworkers faced no criminal charges whatsoever. Congress later paid the Chinese government a small indemnity for the property losses. Not for the lives, just the property. 10. The Hell's Canyon Massacre. This one is so obscure that even historians rarely mention it. In the spring of 1887, a gang of horse thieves and small-time criminals in eastern Oregon murdered between 31 and 34 Chinese gold miners in a canyon along the Snake River. The miners were from the Yup Wo Company, working claims in the remote Hell's Canyon area. The killers robbed them of their gold, their equipment, and their supplies, then dumped the bodies in the river. Some of the bodies washed up downstream over the following weeks. Nobody did anything. A Chinese diplomat eventually pushed for an investigation. A grand jury was convened 2 years later. 3 men were indicted. None were ever brought to trial. The perpetrators simply went back to their lives. One of the alleged ringleaders was a teenager at the time of the murders. He went on to become a respected rancher in the region. 34 men were murdered for their gold and not a single person was ever punished. 11. The Sand Creek Massacre. On November 29, 1864, Colorado militia attacked a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment along Sand Creek. The people camped there believed they were under the protection of the U.S. government. Chief Black Kettle had even been given an American flag by the government and told that flying it would guarantee his people's safety. He flew it that morning. It didn't help. Colonel John Chivington led around 700 militia in an attack that killed somewhere between 150 and 500 people, the majority of them women, children, and elderly. Chivington had reportedly told his men to kill and scalp all big and little. They did exactly that, and worse. Mutilations were extensive and documented. Soldiers displayed body parts as trophies at a Denver theater to cheering crowds. A congressional investigation condemned the massacre. Chivington faced no criminal charges because he had already resigned his commission. He later became a newspaper editor in Denver. The U.S. Army officially called it a battle for decades. 12. The Marias Massacre. On January 23, 1870, U.S. Army troops under Major Eugene Baker attacked a Blackfeet village on the Marias River in Montana. Baker had been ordered to attack a band led by a chief named Mountain Chief who was suspected of raid activity. He attacked the wrong band entirely. The village he destroyed was led by Heavy Runner, a chief known for his peaceful relations with the U.S. government. Heavy Runner reportedly ran toward the soldiers holding up his papers showing he was a friendly chief. He was shot immediately. The soldiers killed 173 people. At least 140 of them were women, children, and elderly men. Most of the adult men were away hunting. The village was already suffering from a severe smallpox outbreak, which the soldiers knew before they attacked. The Army's initial reports described it as a great victory. When the truth emerged in Congress, the response was mostly silence. Baker received no serious punishment. The Army stood by its commander. 13. The Bear River Massacre. On January 29, 1863, U.S. Army Colonel Patrick Connor led 300 soldiers against a Shoshone winter encampment in what is now southeastern Idaho. The Shoshone, led by Chief Bear Hunter, had been in conflict with settlers and miners moving through their territory that had been theirs for generations. The attack lasted 4 hours. When it was over, between 250 and 500 Shoshone people were dead. Women were assaulted. Survivors attempting to flee across the frozen Bear River drowned or froze to death. Teepees were burned with people still inside. The U.S. military lost 23 soldiers. Patrick Connor was promoted to brigadier general for his actions. He was celebrated in California and Utah newspapers as a hero. The Bear River Massacre was, by death count, likely one of the deadliest attacks on Native Americans in U.S. history. For most of American history, it was called the Battle of Bear River, a word choice that tells you everything about how history decides what gets remembered and how. 14. The Camp Grant Massacre. In the spring of 1871, a group of Apache people, mostly women and children, had come to Camp Grant in Arizona Territory seeking peace. The Army commander at the post, Lieutenant Royal Whitman, fed them, gave them land to farm, and began a genuine process of establishing peaceful relations. About 500 Apache were living near the fort under what amounted to military protection. On April 30th, a coalition of Tucson citizens, Mexican residents, and Tohono O'odham warriors attacked the sleeping camp before dawn. They killed at least 144 people. 130 of them were women. Around 28 Apache children were taken captive and sold into slavery in Mexico. The attack took about 30 minutes. President Grant called it murder, which it was. A trial was held in Tucson. The jury deliberated for 19 minutes and acquitted all 104 defendants. The peaceful outreach that Lieutenant Whitman had built was destroyed, and the Apache Wars intensified for another decade. Peace was the crime that got those people killed. 15. The Conestoga Massacre. In colonial Pennsylvania, the Susquehannock people who lived near Conestoga town had done everything the government said they should. They signed treaties, they converted to Christianity, they worked as farmers and basket makers, and they lived under official protection from the colonial authorities. In December 1763, a vigilante group of Scotch-Irish frontiersmen called the Paxton Boys decided that any native person was an enemy, no matter what the government said. They rode into Conestoga town, killed 6 people, and burned the village. The remaining Susquehannock survivors were placed in a workhouse in Lancaster for their safety. 2 weeks later, the Paxton Boys broke in, murdered the rest, men, women, and children, and mutilated their bodies. The provincial government issued proclamations and rewards for the killers. No one was ever convicted. The Susquehannock, as a distinct people in Pennsylvania, were effectively wiped out by men the authorities refused to seriously pursue. 16. The Cherokee slaveholding elite. Your textbook probably showed the Cherokee Nation as peaceful farmers driven west purely because of land greed. That's partly true, but it leaves out an ugly detail. By the early 1800s, some wealthy Cherokee leaders in the Southeast owned black people as chattel slaves. They built plantations, adopted European-style laws, and held enslaved Africans just like their white neighbors. Figures like John Ross and Major Ridge moved in elite circles where enslaved labor was normal. The Cherokee Nation even passed its own slave codes. When the U.S. negotiated removal treaties, some Cherokee slaveholders brought their enslaved people with them on the Trail of Tears, forcing black men, women, and children to march west in chains alongside indigenous families. After resettlement in Indian Territory, slavery continued within the nation until the Civil War and the 1866 treaty with the U.S. The story is more complicated than noble victims versus cruel outsiders. It also includes native elites participating in the same racist system that oppressed them. 17. The California Genocide. After the United States grabbed California in 1848, the gold rush turned the region into a frenzy of settlers, miners, and speculators. For the native peoples of California, it became a death sentence. State officials openly called for extermination. The first governor, Peter Burnett, said a war of extermination would continue until the Indian race becomes extinct. The state legislature authorized militia campaigns against native communities and reimbursed the costs. Men formed volunteer companies, massacred entire villages, and then sent Sacramento the bill for ammunition and provisions. Bounties were paid for indigenous scalps and heads. Children were kidnapped and sold as indentured servants under laws that legalized the forced apprenticeship of native miners. Between disease, starvation, and organized killing, California's native population collapsed from an estimated 150,000 in 1848 to around 30,000 by 1870. The state and federal governments funded, armed, and legally protected what historians now call the California Genocide, then quietly filed it under frontier conflicts. 18. The Trail of Tears stockades. When you picture the Trail of Tears, you probably imagine long columns of Cherokee walking west on muddy roads. What you rarely hear about is what came first. In 1838, U.S. troops and Georgia militia fanned out across Cherokee lands, rounding up families at gunpoint. People were forced from their homes with minutes to gather belongings. They were marched to makeshift stockades, crowded, filthy prison camps ringed with guards. Thousands of Cherokees spent weeks or months in these pens before the actual forced marches began. Disease ripped through the camps. Food and clean water were scarce. Sanitation didn't exist. Eyewitnesses described people dying in the enclosures, buried in shallow graves nearby. Some Cherokee who tried to escape back to their homes were shot. By the time the official removal caravan started westward, many had already buried relatives in the shadow of those stockade walls. The suffering that defines the Trail of Tears didn't start on the road. It started behind fences. 19. The Long Walk of the Navajo. In the 1860s, the U.S. Army decided the solution to persistent conflict with the Diné, the Navajo people, was to remove them entirely from their homeland. Under General James Carleton and the notorious Kit Carson, the military burned crops, destroyed orchards, and slaughtered sheep, the economic and spiritual core of Navajo life. Starving families eventually surrendered. From 1863 to 1866, roughly 9,000 Navajo were forced to march hundreds of miles to a reservation at Bosque Redondo in eastern New Mexico. This is remembered as the Long Walk. People were shot if they fell behind. Children and elders died along the way from exposure, thirst, and exhaustion. Bosque Redondo was a disaster. Poor soil, brackish water, disease, and constant hunger. At least a quarter of the people interned there died. Only after years of failure did the government allow survivors to return to a portion of their original homeland under the 1868 treaty. The scars of that forced march still shape Navajo memory and identity. 20. The Dakota War executions. In 1862, in what is now Minnesota, the Dakota people were starving. The U.S. government had delayed or withheld treaty payments and food supplies while white settlers flooded their lands. Desperation exploded into violence in August 1862, when some Dakota men attacked settler communities, sparking what's called the Dakota War. After several weeks, hundreds of Dakota surrendered, believing they'd get some form of negotiation. Instead, the U.S. Army held mass trials that sometimes lasted minutes. Defendants often had no lawyers, no translators, and no understanding of the charges. Military commissions sentenced 303 Dakota men to death. President Lincoln reviewed the list and commuted most of the sentences, but he still approved 39 executions. On December 26, 1862, 38 Dakota men were hanged simultaneously in Mankato, Minnesota, in the largest mass execution in U.S. history. Their bodies were quickly buried, then dug up by doctors and used for medical research. The surviving Dakota were expelled from the state. Minnesota celebrates its pioneer heritage. It rarely dwells on the gallows. 21. Indian boarding schools. For over a century, federal Indian policy wasn't just about taking land. It was about taking children. Beginning in the late 1800s, Native children across the U.S. and Canada were seized from their families and sent to boarding schools run by the government or Christian churches. The slogan of this system was explicit: kill the Indian in him, save the man. At institutions like Carlisle Indian Industrial School, children had their hair cut short, their traditional clothes taken away, and their native names replaced with English ones. Speaking their language or practicing their culture was punished. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, and forced labor were common. Many children died from disease, malnutrition, and neglect, and were buried in unmarked or poorly marked graves far from home. Parents who resisted had rations cut or were threatened with prison. The goal wasn't education in any meaningful sense. It was cultural erasure. The United States has only recently begun to acknowledge the scope of the boarding school system and the generations of trauma it created. 22. The Osage Reign of Terror. In the 1920s, the Osage Nation in Oklahoma became some of the richest people per capita in the world. Oil had been discovered on their land, and federal law said the mineral rights belonged collectively to the tribe. Each enrolled Osage had a head right, a share of the oil money. On paper, that sounds like justice. In practice, it became a feeding frenzy. The government decided many Osage were incompetent to manage their own wealth and forced them under white guardianship. Local bankers, lawyers, and businessmen were appointed to protect Osage finances. Instead, guardians stole, skimmed, and controlled every purchase. Then came the killings. Osage with valuable head rights were poisoned, shot, blown up, their deaths ruled accidents or natural causes. White spouses and guardians inherited the oil shares. Federal authorities mostly looked the other way until the body count grew impossible to ignore. A few killers were eventually prosecuted, but most murders were never solved. The guardianship system helped enable a slow-motion massacre for profit. 23. The Palmer Raids. After World War I, the U.S. was gripped by what's now called the First Red Scare. Strikes, bombings, and the Russian Revolution convinced many politicians that a Bolshevik uprising was imminent. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer saw an opportunity. In 1919 and 1920, he authorized mass raids on suspected radicals, immigrants, union organizers, socialists, and anarchists. With the help of a young J. Edgar Hoover, the Justice Department compiled lists, infiltrated meetings, and then swept in at night. Agents burst into homes and offices without proper warrants, arrested people on vague charges, and held them in overcrowded jails. Many were denied lawyers or even told why they'd been detained. Hundreds of non-citizens were deported on flimsy evidence. Courts later criticized the raids as lawless, Civil liberties groups were outraged. But in classrooms, the Palmer raids often appear as a footnote, if at all, instead of a reminder that hysteria can turn the Constitution into optional paperwork. 24. The Red Summer of 1919. The end of World War I was supposed to bring celebration. For many Black Americans, it brought terror. In 1919, racial violence erupted across the country in what came to be called the Red Summer. Black veterans returned from Europe in uniform, having fought for democracy, and refused to quietly accept Jim Crow. They demanded better wages, equal treatment, and protection from lynching. White mobs responded with riots in cities like Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Elaine, Arkansas. The pattern was grimly familiar: rumors about Black men, competition for jobs and housing, and then organized white violence. Homes and neighborhoods were attacked. In some cities, police either joined the mobs or stood aside. Black communities sometimes armed themselves in self-defense, which was later portrayed as insurrection. Hundreds were killed nationwide, most of them Black. Official reports downplayed the white instigators. In many history textbooks, the Red Summer is a sentence or two, not the nationwide backlash against Black claims to full citizenship that it really was. 25. The bonus army eviction. During the Great Depression, World War I veterans were promised a bonus payment for their service, but not until 1945. Hungry and jobless, tens of thousands marched on Washington in 1932, demanding early payment. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or Bonus Army. Families lived in tent cities and makeshift shacks along the Anacostia River and around the Capitol, lobbying peacefully. Congress rejected their demands. President Herbert Hoover decided the camps had to go. He ordered the Army under General Douglas MacArthur to clear the veterans out. Troops advanced with bayonets and tear gas. Cavalry units rode through the streets. Tanks rolled past the Capitol against men who had once worn the uniform themselves. The camps were burned. At least 2 veterans were killed, many were injured, and families were driven out with their belongings destroyed. The government sent a clear message: gratitude had an expiration date, and it ended when veterans became politically inconvenient. 26. The Battle of Blair Mountain. Labor history in America rarely makes it into standard textbooks, and when it does, it's usually a paragraph. Almost never do you hear that one of the largest armed uprisings since the Civil War happened in West Virginia coal country. In 1921, miners in Mingo and Logan counties were fighting for the right to unionize against brutal company conditions, scrip wages, company housing, private armed guards, and deadly mines. After union activists were killed and martial law abused, thousands of miners armed themselves and marched toward Logan County, wearing red bandanas around their necks. They faced off against coal company deputies, private planes dropping homemade bombs, and local authorities. The federal government eventually sent in troops, including Army aircraft. Faced with the U.S. military, the miners stood down. Hundreds were later indicted for treason and murder. Few were convicted, but the Union drive was smashed. The Battle of Blair Mountain was buried under patriotic myths of harmonious labor and management. 27. The Haymarket Aftermath. On May 4, 1886, Chicago workers rallied in Haymarket Square to support an 8-hour workday. It was part of a broader labor movement challenging long hours and dangerous factory conditions. The meeting was peaceful and nearly over when police moved in to break it up. Someone whose identity has never been confirmed threw a bomb. It exploded among the officers, killing several. Police opened fire. Chaos followed, and workers and officers both died. The real story, though, unfolded in the courtroom. 8 anarchist labor leaders were arrested, not because evidence tied them to the bomb, but because of their ideas and speeches. The trial was a showpiece of panic, biased jury, questionable witnesses, and a judge hostile to the defendants. 4 men were hanged, 1 died in prison, and later governors admitted the trial was deeply flawed. The Haymarket affair became May Day for workers around the world. In U.S. textbooks, it's often reduced to violence at a labor rally, with the state's role in executing dissenters politely skipped. 28. The Pullman Strike Crackdown. In 1894, workers at the Pullman Palace Car Company outside Chicago lived in a model company town. Pullman owned the houses, the stores, and the jobs. When an economic downturn hit, the company cut wages but kept rents and prices the same. Workers ended up owing money to the very boss who underpaid them. They went on strike with support from the American Railway Union, led by Eugene the Debs. Soon, rail traffic across much of the country was disrupted as union members refused to handle Pullman cars. Railroad executives and the federal government framed the strike as an attack on the mail and interstate commerce. President Grover Cleveland's administration got a federal injunction to break the strike, then sent in troops. Clashes left workers dead, rail yards in flames, and the union crushed. Debs went to prison, where he read socialist literature and emerged more radical. The Pullman strike helped cement the government's role as enforcer for big business, using interstate commerce as the excuse. 29. The Homestead Strike Battle. In 1892, the Carnegie Steel plant at Homestead, Pennsylvania became a war zone. Management wanted to break the powerful Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, one of the strongest unions in the country. Andrew Carnegie went to Scotland and left his ruthless manager, Henry Clay Frick, to do the dirty work. Frick locked out the workers and built a fortress-like fence topped with barbed wire and sniper towers around the mill. Then he hired 300 Pinkerton detectives, private armed guards, to retake the plant by force. When the Pinkertons tried to land by barge on the Monongahela River, thousands of armed workers and townspeople met them. A day-long gun battle followed. Men on both sides were shot. A cannon was brought out. The barges were riddled with bullets. Eventually, the Pinkertons surrendered and were beaten by the crowd as they were marched through town. The state responded by sending 8,000 National Guard troops to occupy Homestead and protect strikebreakers. The Union lost. Homestead became a model for how to crush organized labor with a mix of private armies and state power. 30. The Bisbee Deportation. In July 1917, copper miners in Bisbee, Arizona, went on strike, demanding better wages, safer conditions, and an end to discriminatory hiring against Mexican and Eastern European workers. The mining companies labeled them radicals and threats to wartime production. Rather than negotiate, local elites organized a vigilante force of about 2,000 men. Business owners, deputies, and citizens deputized on the spot. They rounded up more than 1,200 suspected strikers and sympathizers at gunpoint, many of them American citizens. Men were forced into a makeshift stockade at a baseball field, denied food and water, then herded into cattle cars. With the blessing of the sheriff and company officials, the train carried them across the desert into New Mexico. They were dumped in the middle of nowhere near Hermanas, without shelter or supplies, and warned never to return. The federal government under Wilson declined to prosecute anyone involved, despite a later investigation calling it a clear violation of civil liberties. In classroom versions, you might hear about labor unrest in the West, but not that entire workforces were kidnapped and exiled at the command of mining companies. 31. The Triangle Fire Locked Doors. In 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City employed mostly young immigrant women sewing blouses in crowded, flammable conditions. The building had supposedly modern safety measures, but the owners had a different priority, preventing theft and unauthorized breaks. To control the workers, they routinely locked exit doors during shifts, leaving only one door open where bags could be checked. When a fire broke out on the 8th floor, the building turned into a trap. Flames and smoke spread quickly through piles of cloth and wooden tables. Workers ran to the exits and found them locked. The fire escape collapsed under the weight of people. Some women burned inside. Over 60 jumped from windows to escape the flames, their bodies hitting the sidewalk in front of horrified onlookers. In total, 146 workers died, many of them teenagers. The owners were tried for manslaughter but acquitted. They later collected insurance money that exceeded the death settlements paid to families. The disaster did spur new safety and labor laws, but textbooks tend to frame it as a tragic accident, not the predictable result of bosses literally locking workers in. 32. The Coal Wars Company Towns. Coal country in Appalachia wasn't just about dangerous mines. It was a whole engineered system of control. Companies owned the houses, the schools, the churches, even the graveyards. Miners were paid not in real money, but in company scrip, tokens only usable at the company's store, where prices were inflated. If you complained, your rent could be raised overnight. If you tried to unionize, you could be evicted with your family and find your name on a blacklist. Private detectives and gun thugs, often from the Baldwin Felts Agency, patrolled the towns, spied on meetings, and beat or killed organizers. When miners went on strike, companies evicted them into tent colonies along the roads, then called in state troopers or federal troops when conflict escalated. The Paint Creek, Cabin Creek strikes, the Ludlow Massacre in Colorado, the pitched battles before Blair Mountain, all grew out of this company town system. In the standard narrative, coal miners are rugged individualists powering industrial growth. Left out is how many lived in a kind of corporate feudalism, under constant threat of hunger, homelessness, and violence. 33. The Banana Wars occupations. At the turn of the 20th century, the United States sent troops again and again into Central America and the Caribbean in what came to be known as the Banana Wars. Officially, these interventions were about stability and protecting American lives. In practice, they were about protecting American business interests, especially big fruit companies and banks. Marines occupied Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Honduras, and more, sometimes for decades. In Nicaragua, the U.S. helped install and support regimes friendly to U.S. investors and rewrote the Constitution to allow American control of railroads and customs houses. In Honduras, repeated interventions protected United Fruit and other corporations from taxes and land reforms, giving rise to the term Banana Republic. In Haiti, the U.S. seized control of the national treasury, used forced labor for infrastructure, and maintained an occupation from 1915 to 1934. Local resistance was often labeled banditry and crushed with overwhelming force. In textbooks, these events get boiled down to a phrase like expanded U.S. influence in Latin America, as if they were polite diplomatic visits instead of military occupations to enforce corporate profits. 34. The Philippine-American War torture. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, the U.S. decided to keep the Philippines rather than grant independence, despite earlier promises. Filipinos who had fought Spain expecting freedom now faced a new colonial ruler. They resisted, and the Philippine-American War followed from 1899 to 1902, with brutal guerrilla fighting in which U.S. troops committed widespread atrocities. One infamous technique was the water cure, an early form of waterboarding. Prisoners were forced to swallow large amounts of water, then had their stomachs pressed or stepped on to make them talk. Villages suspected of aiding rebels were burned. Civilians were herded into reconcentration zones where disease and hunger spread. Some U.S. officers ordered kill ratios that essentially meant shooting anyone of military age in certain areas. American newspapers eventually exposed some of this, leading to hearings where officers blandly described torture as necessary. Official narratives for decades called it an insurrection and downplayed the death toll, which included hundreds of thousands of Filipino civilians from violence, famine, and disease. The war is often a paragraph between the Spanish-American War and building an American empire, with the torture blurred into vague, harsh tactics. 35. The Bedtime Massacre. On the southern Philippine island of Jolo, the Moro people resisted both Spanish and then American attempts to control them. In 1906, several hundred Moros, men, women, and children, took refuge in the volcanic crater of Bedtime to avoid new American-imposed policies like disarmament and head taxes. U.S. authorities labeled them outlaws. Instead of negotiating, they sent in troops armed with rifles, machine guns, and artillery to storm the crater, which had steep sides and offered little cover for the people inside. Over several days, soldiers surrounded the rim and fired down into the densely packed crowd. When it was over, somewhere between 600 and 1,000 Moros were dead. Reports describe bodies piled 3 deep, many of them women and children. Only a few dozen survivors were found. President Theodore Roosevelt congratulated the troops. Photographs of American officers posing over the crater with Moro bodies caused some outrage back home, but no one was punished. Official accounts called it a battle, as if it were 2 equal armies on a field, rather than a massacre of civilians trapped in a natural bowl with guns raining down from above. 36. The Haitian Constitution rewrite. After invading Haiti in 1915, the U.S. Marines didn't just patrol streets. They rewired the country's laws. American banks and investors wanted access to Haitian land, but the Haitian Constitution explicitly banned foreign land ownership. A safeguard put in place after a successful slave revolt created the world's first black republic. So, U.S. occupation authorities pushed a new constitution in 1918 that quietly removed that protection. It was drafted in part by future President Franklin D. Roosevelt. When the Haitian legislature resisted, the U.S. simply dissolved it and held a referendum under occupation. The new constitution passed amid intimidation and fraud. American companies soon acquired large plantations and concessions, displacing small farmers. Textbooks might mention U.S. assistance in modernizing Haiti, but usually skip the part where the occupation tore up a hard-won anti-colonial safeguard to reopen the country to foreign land grabs. 37. The overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani. Hawaii didn't just drift peacefully into the United States. It was taken. In 1893, Queen Liliuokalani tried to restore power to the Hawaiian monarchy and roll back the control of American and European sugar planters who had dominated the islands through a forced constitution. The planters, furious at the threat to their profits and political control, formed a committee of safety and plotted a coup. They didn't act alone. The U.S. minister to Hawaii ordered Marines from the USS Boston ashore, who positioned themselves near government buildings, signaling clear support for the conspirators. Surrounded, outgunned, and not wanting bloodshed for her people, Liliuokalani yielded under protest, expecting the U.S. to reverse the coup. President Grover Cleveland called it an illegal act and pushed for her restoration. Congress and business interests ignored him. A few years later, under President McKinley, the U.S. annexed Hawaii outright. The textbooks often talk about annexation and territorial expansion as if it were a mutual agreement. They rarely dwell on the fact that the last ruling monarch of Hawaii was overthrown by businessmen with U.S. military backup. 38. The Mexican repatriation. During the Great Depression, the U.S. looked for someone to blame for joblessness. Mexican immigrants and even Mexican-American citizens became convenient targets. From roughly 1929 to 1939, local, state, and federal authorities coordinated a mass repatriation campaign. Raids swept through barrios in Los Angeles, Detroit, Chicago, and other cities. Officials staged surprise roundups in parks, workplaces, and homes, pressuring people to voluntarily board trains to Mexico under threat of deportation, loss of relief, or arrest. Many had lived in the U.S. for years. Some had been born here and were citizens. Estimates of how many were expelled range from 400,000 to over 1 million people. Families were broken apart, homes abandoned overnight, lives uprooted. There were no hearings, no due process, and almost no public debate. The policy was later described by some historians as ethnic cleansing. In school, you might hear that immigration slowed during the Depression. You usually don't hear that police literally loaded Mexican families onto trains and pushed them out of the country they called home. 39. Operation Wetback. By the 1950s, the U.S. wanted cheap Mexican labor for agriculture, but also wanted to look tough on illegal immigration. The solution was a mix of recruitment and repression. In 1954, the government launched Operation Wetback, a name so racist that alone explains why it's not highlighted in classrooms. Immigration agents, Border Patrol, and local police conducted massive sweeps across the Southwest. Roadblocks, workplace raids, and door-to-door dragnets filled buses, trucks, and ships with anyone who looked Mexican. Citizenship and legal status were often ignored. Some U.S.-born citizens were deported alongside undocumented workers. People were dumped in remote border areas and in interior Mexico with little food or water. Conditions on transport ships were so bad that some deaths were reported from heat and exposure. Official numbers claim over 1 million returns in 1 year, though many were repeat expulsions of the same people. Textbooks, if they mention it at all, frame it as a tough immigration enforcement program, not as mass roundups that blurred any distinction between citizens and non-citizens. 40. The Bracero Program abuses. From 1942 to 1964, the U.S. ran the Bracero Program, a guest worker system that brought millions of Mexican laborers to work on American farms and railroads. Officially, it was a wartime labor solution with protections, decent housing, fair wages, transportation, and a savings fund. On the ground, it was very different. Workers were fumigated with DDT upon entry, housed in overcrowded barracks, and sent into fields without adequate water or shade. Employers routinely ignored contract terms, forcing people to work long hours in dangerous conditions. A portion of each worker's pay, often 10%, was withheld and supposedly deposited into savings accounts in Mexico for them to collect later. Many never saw that money again. The funds were mismanaged, lost, or simply never returned. Complaints could mean deportation and blacklisting. Braceros were essential to U.S. agriculture, but treated as disposable. In history class, you might hear that the program helped meet labor shortages. The part about systematic wage theft, chemical exposure, and broken promises usually gets a much softer focus. 41. Japanese American internment property loss. When Japanese Americans were forced into camps during World War II, the loss wasn't just time and freedom. It was everything they owned. In 1942, under Executive Order 9066, about 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, two-thirds of them U.S. citizens, were ordered to leave their homes on the West Coast with only what they could carry. They had days or weeks to sell houses, farms, businesses, cars, furniture, and personal belongings. Predatory buyers knew they were desperate. Property sold for pennies on the dollar, if at all. Some stored belongings with neighbors or in rented warehouses, only to find them stolen or destroyed when they came back. Businesses built over decades vanished overnight. After the war, many families had nothing to return to and had to start over in unfamiliar cities with no capital and ongoing discrimination. The government eventually issued an apology and modest payments in the 1980s, but those didn't restore lost land, generational wealth, or community networks. Textbooks often stress that internment was unfortunate but later acknowledged as wrong. They say less about how the policy transferred huge amounts of property from a targeted minority to the broader society. 42. Italian American internment. Japanese Americans weren't the only ones targeted during World War II, though their suffering was the most extensive. Italian immigrants also found themselves labeled enemy aliens. After the U.S. entered the war, more than 600,000 Italian non-citizens were required to register with the government, carry special ID cards, and submit to curfews and travel restrictions. In California and other coastal areas, some were forced to move inland away from sensitive zones. Fishing communities, a backbone of Italian-American life, were hit hard when boats were seized or banned from certain waters. Radios, cameras, and weapons were confiscated from homes. Around 10,000 Italians were formally classified as enemy aliens, and several thousand were arrested. Between 1,500 and 3,000 were interned in camps alongside Germans and Japanese. Many had lived in the U.S. for decades, with sons serving in the U.S. military. The policy quietly eased in 1942, and in 1944 enemy alien status was lifted, but the damage to livelihoods and reputations lingered. This episode rarely appears in textbooks, making it easy to believe that civil liberties abuses in wartime were limited to one group instead of part of a broader pattern. 43. German American internment. During World War II, suspicion didn't stop at the Pacific. German nationals and German Americans were swept up too. After Pearl Harbor, the government labeled tens of thousands of German-born residents as enemy aliens. They faced curfews, travel bans, job losses, and arrests. About 11,000 were sent to internment camps in places like Texas, North Dakota, and Montana. Some had lived in the U.S. for decades with families and businesses. The U.S. also pressured Latin American countries to round up residents of German descent and ship them north, where they could be interned or traded in prisoner exchanges with Nazi Germany. Many of these people had no ties to the Nazi regime beyond ancestry. There were no public trials, no meaningful appeals. When it's mentioned at all, it's usually as a footnote to Japanese American incarceration, not as its own program of mass suspicion and indefinite detention based largely on ethnicity. 44. The Zoot Suit Riots. In 1943, Los Angeles became a battleground over clothing and race. Mexican-American teenagers who wore flashy zoot suits, baggy pants, long coats, wide-brimmed hats were already seen as troublemakers by white Angelenos and the press. Tension boiled over when U.S. sailors on shore leave began roaming the streets in groups, targeting these youths. They dragged them from streetcars and movie theaters, beat them, stripped off their clothes, and left them bleeding. For several nights, servicemen and mobs attacked mostly Mexican American, Black, and Filipino youths, while police mostly stood aside. When arrests were made, they almost always targeted the victims, not the attackers. Local newspapers framed it as a crackdown on gangs rather than racist violence. The city eventually banned zoot suits as a public nuisance instead of confronting the attacks themselves. Textbooks may mention the riots as a cultural clash or wartime tension. They rarely dwell on how law enforcement and media effectively sided with the mobs. 45. The Lavender Scare. While McCarthyism hunted alleged communists, another purge was happening in the same hallways. Gay and lesbian federal workers were systematically driven out of government jobs. In the late 1940s and 1950s, officials claimed that homosexuals were security risks, supposedly vulnerable to blackmail by foreign agents. Under this logic, thousands of people were interrogated, outed, and fired from the State Department, the military, the CIA, and other agencies. Some were followed, their bars and social circles mapped, their private lives cataloged in thick, secret files. The Eisenhower administration formalized the purge with an executive order explicitly barring sexual perverts from federal employment. Careers ended quietly. Suicides followed. The policy helped cement the idea that queer people were inherently dangerous or immoral, justifying discrimination far beyond Washington. You might learn about the Red Scare in school, but the Lavender Scare, the parallel campaign against LGBTQ workers, usually gets a line, if that, even though it ruined thousands of lives for decades. 46. COINTELPRO. Officially, it stood for Counterintelligence Program. In practice, it was the FBI's long-running war on dissent. From the 1950s through the early 1970s, the FBI ran COINTELPRO operations against civil rights groups, black liberation movements, anti-war organizations, socialists, feminists, American Indian activists, even some environmentalists. The tactics went far beyond surveillance. Agents planted informants to stir internal fights, forged letters to break up marriages and organizations, spread false rumors to discredit leaders, and encouraged violent splits. They pressured landlords and employers to evict or fire activists. They sent anonymous tips to the press and local police to trigger raids and arrests. The goal was explicit in FBI memos: to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize groups considered subversive. COINTELPRO was only exposed in 1971 when activists broke into an FBI office in Pennsylvania and leaked files. The Bureau promised reforms, but many of the same tools, surveillance, informants, disruption, continued under different names. School textbooks might praise the FBI for fighting organized crime, while skipping the part where it tried to dismantle lawful political movements. 47. The FBI letter to Martin Luther King Jr. You might hear that the FBI monitored MLK. The truth was uglier. Under COINTELPRO, the Bureau wiretapped King's phones, bugged his hotel rooms, and recorded his private conversations and alleged affairs. In 1964, they took it a step further. Anonymous FBI agents mailed King a package containing some of those recordings along with a threatening letter. The letter accused him of being immoral and a fraud, suggested his secrets would be exposed, and strongly implied that he should kill himself before that happened. It ended with a taunting countdown. The FBI hoped to break him psychologically, damage his marriage, and silence his leadership. King and his allies understood the letter's source and refused to fold, but the harassment continued until his assassination. In many classrooms, King is turned into a safe, almost saintly figure from a long-resolved past. The fact that his own government tried to drive him to suicide using blackmail material stays mostly in archives and footnotes. 48. Fred Hampton's killing. Fred Hampton was 21 years old, a rising leader of the Black Panther Party in Chicago. He organized free breakfast programs, health clinics, and multiracial coalitions. That combination of charisma and community organizing made him a prime COINTELPRO target. The FBI planted an informant in his inner circle, who provided detailed floor plans of Hampton's apartment and drugged his drink the night of the raid. In the early hours of December 4, 1969, Chicago police and state's attorney's officers stormed the apartment with a hail of bullets. Hampton was shot in his bed, reportedly after officers confirmed he was still alive, and then fired at close range. Another Panther, Mark Clark, was also killed. Many others were wounded. Initial police claims of a fierce gun battle collapsed when ballistics showed almost all bullets came from law enforcement. Later civil lawsuits unearthed evidence of FBI involvement and COINTELPRO directives, leading to a settlement, but no criminal convictions. In textbooks, Hampton is often not mentioned at all, or the incident is reduced to a vague shootout, erasing the coordinated role of federal intelligence in eliminating a young black leader. 49. The Move bombing. In 1985, the city of Philadelphia turned a neighborhood dispute into a war zone. Move was a black liberation group living in a row house on Osage Avenue, clashing for years with neighbors and police over noise, guns, and ideology. On May 13, police surrounded the house, evacuated the block, and launched a massive operation with tear gas, water cannons, and gunfire. When the standoff didn't end, they used a state police helicopter to drop a satchel bomb made with C4 explosives provided by the federal government onto the roof. The explosion ignited a fire. Officials ordered firefighters to let the fire burn as a tactic to force Move members out. The blaze spread through the tightly packed row houses, destroying over 60 homes. 11 people in the Move house were killed, including 5 children. Only 1 adult and 1 child survived. No officials went to prison for it. A city commission later called the decision unconscionable, but the episode still floats at the margins of American memory. In school, you might learn about urban unrest in the 1960s and 70s. You're less likely to hear that, in 1985, a U.S. city literally bombed its own citizens and burned a neighborhood to the ground. 50. The Attica Prison Uprising. In September 1971, Attica Correctional Facility in New York exploded after years of abuse, overcrowding, and racist treatment. Prisoners seized control of most of the prison and took guards and civilian workers as hostages, demanding better living conditions, medical care, and political rights. For 4 days they negotiated with state officials, with outside observers like journalists and civil rights attorneys urging a peaceful settlement. Then Governor Nelson Rockefeller refused to visit, rejected key demands, and ordered a retaking by force. State troopers and correction officers stormed the prison yard using tear gas, shotguns, and rifles. In the chaos, they killed 39 people in a matter of minutes, including 10 hostages. Early statements from officials blamed prisoners for slitting hostages' throats, a lie repeated in headlines. Autopsies later showed they all died from police gunfire. The state blocked investigations for years, resisted compensation, and shielded troopers from accountability. Attica gets reduced to a prison riot, not a massacre driven by a brutal state response. 51. The Kent State shootings. On May 4, 1970, students at Kent State University in Ohio gathered to protest President Nixon's expansion of the Vietnam War into Cambodia. The campus had already seen clashes, burned ROTC buildings, and National Guard deployments in the days before. That morning, hundreds assembled on a campus commons, mostly unarmed, some chanting, some just watching. The Ohio National Guard moved to disperse them with tear gas, then advanced up a hill. Without clear orders, several guardsmen suddenly turned, aimed their M1 rifles and pistols, and fired into the crowd. 13 seconds of gunfire left 4 students dead and 9 wounded, some shot in the back, 1 paralyzed for life. 2 of the dead weren't even protesting, they were walking to class. Officials and commentators first blamed radical students, implying the victims brought it on themselves. Grand juries indicted protesters, not the shooters. When the Guard finally settled a civil suit, they admitted no wrongdoing. Textbooks often show the famous photo of a crying girl over a body, then move on without dwelling on the fact that U.S. troops killed unarmed students on an American campus. 52. The Jackson State killings. Less than 2 weeks after Kent State, Mississippi had its own campus bloodshed, this time at a historically black college. On the night of May 14-15, 1970, Students at Jackson State College gathered amid ongoing anger about racism, police harassment, and the war. Tensions escalated near a women's dormitory after fires were set and rumors spread that a white motorist had been attacked. City police and state highway patrolmen arrived with shotguns and rifles, lining up on the street facing the dorm. Claiming they saw a sniper or heard glass breaking, officers suddenly unleashed a barrage of gunfire, over 400 rounds in under a minute, into the dorm and surrounding area. 2 students, Philip Lafayette Gibbs and high schooler James Earl Green, were killed. At least a dozen others were wounded. Bullet holes peppered the building. No firearms were ever found in student hands. Unlike Kent State, Jackson State received little national mourning or media focus. A federal commission criticized the police, but no officer was prosecuted. In many classrooms, if it's mentioned at all, it's a one-line aside, if that, showing which student deaths mattered more to the country. 53. The Orangeburg Massacre. Before Kent State, before Jackson State, South Carolina had already seen police gun down black student protesters. In early February 1968, students from historically black colleges in Orangeburg tried to desegregate a local bowling alley that refused to admit them. Night after night, police and state troopers confronted the protesters, beating some with batons and arresting dozens. On February 8, students gathered on the South Carolina State College campus around a bonfire, angry but largely contained on school grounds. Without warning, highway patrolmen opened fire with shotguns loaded with buckshot and birdshot into the crowd. 3 students, Samuel Hammond, Henry Smith, and Delano Middleton, were killed. At least 27 were injured, many shot in the back while running away. Officials immediately claimed they'd been under sniper fire, a lie that evaporated under scrutiny. No trooper was convicted. Instead, civil rights leader Cleveland Sellers was imprisoned for rioting. Orangeburg is almost entirely absent from national memory, even though it was one of the first major campus massacres of the era, driven by segregation and state violence. 54. The Greensboro Massacre. On November 3, 1979, a coalition called the Communist Workers' Party organized an anti-Klan, anti-racist march in Greensboro, North Carolina. They publicly challenged the Ku Klux Klan and American Nazi Party, calling them out and daring them to show up. The Klan and Nazis took the challenge. A caravan of their cars rolled into the black working-class neighborhood where protesters were gathering. With TV news cameras rolling, the men calmly retrieved rifles and shotguns from their trunks, walked toward the demonstrators, and opened fire at close range. 5 anti-racist activists were killed, many others wounded. Police, who knew of the threats, were conspicuously absent from the scene until after the shooting. Later trials revealed that one of the Klansmen was a paid police informant and an ATF informant had helped plan events. All white juries acquitted the shooters in 2 criminal trials. Only a later civil suit produced a modest settlement and an admission that police negligence contributed. Despite the footage and the evidence, the Greensboro Massacre barely appears in history books as an example of how the state and far-right violence intersected in broad daylight. 55. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service launched a study in Macon County, Alabama, to observe the natural history of untreated syphilis in black men. They recruited around 600 poor black sharecroppers, about 400 with syphilis and 200 without, telling them they were getting free medical care for bad blood. Instead, doctors secretly withheld effective treatment, even after penicillin became the standard cure in the 1940s. The men received sham procedures, spinal taps described as special treatment, and occasional placebos. Many went blind, insane, or died from complications. Their wives were infected. Some children were born with congenital syphilis. Researchers tracked their deterioration for 40 years. When whistleblowers finally exposed the study in 1972, public outrage was massive. A class action lawsuit followed and the government settled, but no researcher faced criminal charges. A formal presidential apology came only in 1997. Textbooks often reduced Tuskegee to a brief cautionary tale about medical ethics, smoothing over the racial exploitation and deliberate deception that fueled it. 56. Henrietta Lacks Cells. In 1951, A black woman named Henrietta Lacks went to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore for treatment of an aggressive cervical cancer. During her care, doctors took samples of her tumor without telling her or asking for informed consent, a common practice at the time, especially with poor black patients. In the lab, researchers discovered her cancer cells were unusually hardy. They not only survived, they reproduced endlessly. These HeLa cells became the first immortal human cell line, shipped worldwide, used in developing the polio vaccine, chemotherapy drugs, gene mapping, in vitro fertilization, and countless other breakthroughs. Companies made millions selling HeLa cells and related products. Henrietta died that same year, never knowing. For decades, her family had no idea her cells were being used, and they certainly received no compensation. When her identity and story emerged in the 1970s, scientists had already published her genome without permission, raising new privacy concerns. Today, HeLa cells are legendary in medicine. The woman behind them and the racial inequities in how her body was used are often a footnote, not the headline they deserve. 57. Forced sterilization in America. For most of the 20th century, the United States ran a nationwide experiment in eugenics, and almost no one was told. Beginning in the early 1900s, more than 30 states passed laws allowing compulsory sterilization of people labeled unfit, the poor, the disabled, people in asylums, prisoners, and disproportionately people of color. In 1927, the Supreme Court upheld this in Buck v. Bell, with Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes writing the infamous line, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." That ruling was never fully overturned. Under its protection, doctors sterilized at least 60,000 people, often without clear consent, sometimes by lying about the procedure or slipping it in during childbirth or surgery. California alone sterilized around a third of the total, targeting Mexican Americans, indigenous women, and the institutionalized. North Carolina focused heavily on black women on welfare. Some victims were teenagers, or even children. They were told it was an appendectomy, or a shot, or a fix, so they wouldn't have more trouble. Many only discovered years later they'd been rendered infertile. Textbooks briefly mention Nazi eugenics, then skip over the fact that Germany studied and admired American eugenic laws when designing its own. 58. The Puerto Rico birth control trials. When pharmaceutical companies wanted to test early birth control pills, they didn't experiment on well-off women who might sue. They went to Puerto Rico. In the 1950s, with U.S. colonial control shaping the island's policies, American researchers set up clinical trials in poor, mostly Catholic neighborhoods. They offered free contraception to women desperate to avoid more pregnancies in a place already targeted by population control programs. The pills they used contained sky-high hormone doses compared to modern versions. Women reported nausea, blood clots, depression, and other serious side effects. Some died during the trial period, but investigators never seriously probed whether the drug played a role. Consent forms, where they existed, were vague, often in English, and downplayed risks. Many women believed they were receiving a safe, approved medication, not participating in an experiment. Meanwhile, mainland doctors promoted the pill as a feminist breakthrough for middle-class white Americans. The suffering in Puerto Rico remained largely invisible. The successful trial data helped get the pill approved in 1960, sparking a sexual revolution. The women who made that possible were treated as expendable test subjects, not pioneers. 59. The Guatemalan syphilis experiments. If you thought Tuskegee was the worst of it, the same agency ran something even more grotesque, just not on U.S. soil. Between 1946 and 1948, U.S. Public Health Service researchers, working with Guatemalan officials, conducted syphilis and gonorrhea experiments on prisoners, psychiatric patients, soldiers, and sex workers in Guatemala. Unlike Tuskegee, these people weren't just observed, they were deliberately infected. Guards and doctors arranged for sex workers carrying infections to visit prisoners. When that wasn't efficient enough, researchers scraped bacteria directly into open wounds, injected it into spinal fluid, or dripped it onto genitals. Many subjects never signed anything, never understood what was happening, and were never properly treated. At least dozens died. The true number is unknown. The project's lead doctor had previously worked on syphilis studies in the U.S., and went on to become a prominent researcher, The records sat quietly in archives until a historian found them in 2005. In 2010, the US government finally admitted what happened and issued a formal apology. No one was alive to prosecute. Guatemala still deals with the legacy of a study that treated its citizens as disposable disease carriers. 60 MK-Ultra. During the Cold War, the CIA became obsessed with one idea: mind control. They spent at least 2 decades and tens of millions of dollars trying to figure out how to break and reprogram human beings, mostly without their knowledge. Under the codename MK-Ultra, starting in the early 1950s, the CIA funded experiments at universities, prisons, and hospitals, often through front organizations so researchers didn't know who was paying. Other times they absolutely knew. They dosed unwitting subjects with LSD, sometimes for days or weeks at a time, to see if they could induce psychosis, erase memories, or create new identities. They experimented with hypnosis, sensory deprivation tanks, electroshock at many times normal intensity, and combinations designed to de-pattern the mind. Prisoners, psychiatric patients, sex workers' clients, and marginalized people were favorite targets. One CIA employee, Frank Olson, was secretly given LSD, had a breakdown, and died after falling from a hotel window. The agency called it suicide. In 1973, as Watergate erupted, the CIA director ordered most MK-Ultra files destroyed. What we know comes from surviving scraps and congressional hearings in the 1970s. Even those fragments are nightmarish. Schoolbooks usually reduce MK-Ultra to a weird LSD anecdote, not a sprawling torture program. 61. Operation Sea Spray. In the early 1950s, the US military wondered how vulnerable American cities were to biological attack. Instead of simulations, they used actual bacteria on actual people without telling anyone. In 1950, the Navy carried out Operation Sea Spray, releasing massive clouds of Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigii off the coast of San Francisco. Scientists picked these microbes because they were easy to track and believed to be harmless. They watched as the bacteria spread across the city, detected in air samples and on surfaces miles inland. Soon after, a cluster of rare Serratia infections appeared at a local hospital. One man died after a severe urinary tract infection. His family later suspected a link, but the government denied causation. San Francisco never knew it had been used as a test range for germ warfare research. Similar open-air tests happened in other cities, including St. Louis and Minneapolis, where zinc cadmium sulfide and other substances were sprayed over low-income, mostly black neighborhoods. Residents thought they were seeing fog or routine airplane flights. Decades later, when documents came out, the official line remained the same: minimal risk, no real harm, nothing to see here. 62. The radiation experiments. From the dawn of the atomic age through the Cold War, U.S. agencies quietly used patients, soldiers, and ordinary citizens to learn what radiation really did to the human body. They didn't exactly ask. Starting in the 1940s, hospital patients with serious illnesses were given high doses of whole-body radiation or had organs irradiated, supposedly as treatment, while researchers measured effects on their blood, bones, and tissues. Many never gave meaningful informed consent. The military sent soldiers to stand near nuclear test blasts in the Nevada desert or on Pacific Islands, sometimes ordered to march toward Ground Zero to see how close troops could get and still function. Film footage shows men shielding their eyes as the sky turns white, then walking through radioactive dust like it's just another training exercise. In other studies, pregnant women were given radioactive iron in their prenatal vitamins. Prisoners had testicles irradiated to study fertility damage. Cancer patients were injected with experimental radioactive tracers far beyond safe levels. These projects were justified as essential national security research. It wasn't until the 1990s, after a presidential advisory committee dug through archives, that the government publicly acknowledged hundreds of such experiments and quietly settled some lawsuits. 63. The human plutonium injections. Among the most chilling of the radiation studies were the plutonium injections, carried out as the U.S. raced to build nuclear weapons. Between 1945 and 1947, at least 18 hospital patients in the United States were secretly injected with plutonium, the same element used in atomic bombs, to see how it moved through the body and how long it stayed in bones and organs. The subjects were poor, elderly, mentally ill, or seriously ill people at facilities in places like Oak Ridge, Rochester, Chicago, and San Francisco. They were told they were receiving special treatments or routine tests, not lethal bomb material. Doctors carefully saved every urine and feces sample, every bit of tissue they could, to measure excretion rates. Some patients died soon after from their underlying diseases, their remains quietly analyzed in labs. Family members were never told. When a reporter and a whistleblowing physicist exposed the program in the 1970s and 1990s, the government finally admitted what had happened. A federal report called the experiments unethical, but stopped short of labeling them criminal. Descendants received small settlements. The scientists kept their careers and often their reputations. In most history books, the word plutonium appears next to bombs and power plants, not human veins. 64. Downwinders of Nevada tests. While the government filmed dramatic mushroom clouds in the Nevada desert, whole communities quietly inhaled the fallout. From 1951 to 1963, more than 900 nuclear detonations took place at the Nevada test site, many in the open air. Officials reassured nearby towns in Utah, Nevada, and Arizona that everything was safe, that the winds would carry the radiation away, that there is no danger. In reality, those winds carried radioactive iodine, cesium, and strontium straight over Mormon ranch towns, native reservations, and small farming communities. Kids played in white, ashy dust that fell like snow. Cows grazed on contaminated grass, their milk concentrating iodine 131 that children drank every day. Cancer clusters started appearing, leukemia in kids, thyroid cancers, rare tumors in people who'd never smoked. For decades, the government denied any link, insisting doses were too low to cause harm. Only in 1990 did Congress pass the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, offering limited payouts to some downwinders. The money didn't match the funerals. Most textbooks talk about the Nevada test site like an empty wasteland, not a place where ordinary Americans became collateral damage. 65. The Castle Bravo fallout. The U.S. didn't just contaminate its own citizens, it also poisoned islands it claimed to protect. In 1954, the United States tested its most powerful hydrogen bomb at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. The shot was codenamed Castle Bravo. It was supposed to yield 6 megatons. Instead, it exploded with 15 megatons, about 1,000 Hiroshimas. The blast vaporized part of the coral reef and sent a massive cloud of radioactive debris high into the atmosphere. Within hours, white powdery ash pulverized radioactive coral began falling like snow on the nearby island of Rongelap, where people had received no warning. Children played in it, rubbed it on their skin. Within days, islanders were vomiting, losing hair, developing burns and sores. U.S. authorities evacuated them only after significant exposure. Farther away, the Japanese fishing boat Lucky Dragon No. 5 was showered with fallout. Crew members developed acute radiation sickness, and one died. International outrage forced the U.S. to pay compensation to Japan and some Marshallese, while downplaying long-term genetic damage, miscarriages, and cancers. Official histories often frame Castle Bravo as a technical miscalculation, not a disaster that poisoned people who never volunteered. 66. Bikini Atoll displacement. To make tests like Castle Bravo possible, people first had to be removed from their homes. The U.S. approached the residents of Bikini Atoll in 1946 with a simple request: temporarily relocate for the good of mankind, so America could test atomic bombs. The Bikinians, fewer than 200 people with deep ties to their land, were assured they could come back soon. They were moved to Rongerik, a smaller, less fertile atoll, where they quickly faced starvation and had to be moved again. Meanwhile, the U.S. turned Bikini into a nuclear shooting range, blasting it with more than 20 nuclear tests, including hydrogen bombs that left craters in the lagoon and saturated the soil. When some islanders were allowed to return in the late 1960s, they were told radiation levels were safe. They planted gardens and ate local food, only to discover dangerously high radiation in their bodies. The U.S. re-evacuated them in the 1970s. Generations of Bikinians have since lived in exile on crowded islands or in the United States, receiving limited compensation while their ancestral home remains largely uninhabitable. School lessons mentioned bikini as a swimsuit brand joke, not a displaced people. 67. The Dover Demon Core accidents. Early nuclear science didn't just kill at a distance, it also killed the people building the bombs. At Los Alamos during World War II, scientists worked with the Demon Core, a subcritical plutonium sphere destined for a third atomic bomb if Japan hadn't surrendered. In 1945, physicist Harry Daghlian was stacking tungsten carbide bricks around the core to measure how close it could get to criticality. He accidentally dropped a brick, driving the core supercritical. A flash of blue light filled the room. Daghlian knocked the bricks away with his bare hands, saving others but receiving a lethal dose of radiation. He died weeks later. Less than a year after that, Louis Slotin was performing a similarly risky experiment, using only a screwdriver to keep two beryllium hemispheres from fully enclosing the core. The screwdriver slipped. Again, a blue flash. Slotin quickly lifted the shell, but he absorbed a massive dose and died 9 days later in agony. These accidents exposed a culture of informal, bravado-driven shortcuts in nuclear labs. Official narratives celebrate the Manhattan Project's genius. They rarely dwell on the men who literally died poking a nuclear core with a screwdriver. 68. The 1921 Army air bombing of Tulsa. The destruction of Tulsa's Greenwood district in 1921 is sometimes called a race riot, as if it were mutual chaos. In reality, it was a coordinated white pogrom against a prosperous black community, and part of that attack came from the sky. Over 35 blocks of black-owned homes, churches, and businesses were burned or looted. Survivors later described small planes flying overhead, dropping incendiary devices and shooting at residents who tried to flee. Official records from the time minimize or dispute this, but multiple eyewitness accounts talk about airplanes raining fire on Greenwood. Some planes were likely privately owned, commandeered by white mobs. There is still debate about whether the Oklahoma National Guard or other official entities participated directly in the aerial attacks, but Guard troops did assist in rounding up black residents and placing them in internment camps. Investigations decades later acknowledged aerial involvement, but stopped short of fully assigning responsibility. Textbooks long reduced Tulsa to a footnote or ignored it entirely, leaving out the fact that, just a few years after World War I, American planes were used to help destroy a black neighborhood on U.S. soil. 69. The My Lai cover-up. You might have heard of the My Lai Massacre as a symbol of Vietnam War brutality, but the cover-up was almost as important as the crime. On March 16, 1968, U.S. soldiers from Charlie Company entered the Vietnamese hamlet of My Lai. Expecting Viet Cong, they found unarmed civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly. Over the next few hours, they murdered more than 500 people, raping, shooting, and executing villagers in ditches. One helicopter pilot, Hugh Thompson, landed his chopper between soldiers and fleeing civilians, threatening to fire on his own side if the killing didn't stop. Back at headquarters, officers quickly crafted a different story. Reports claimed a fierce firefight with enemy combatants and 128 Viet Cong killed. They gave medals to participants. Photographs and eyewitness accounts were buried or ignored. It wasn't until 1969, when soldier Ron Ridenour sent detailed letters to Congress and the press, that the truth began to surface. Even then, the Army tried to contain it, charging a handful of low-level soldiers and largely protecting higher command. Lieutenant William Calley became the lone person convicted, serving only a few years of house arrest. Many textbooks frame My Lai as a tragic aberration, glossing over how the institution's first instinct was to lie. 70. The No Gun Re Massacre. At the start of the Korean War, panic and chaos created deadly policies. In late July 1950, as North Korean forces advanced, U.S. commanders feared enemy troops would hide among refugees streaming south. Orders circulated to stop civilians from crossing American lines, even if that meant using force. Near the village of No Gun Ri, hundreds of South Korean refugees, mostly women, children, and old men, were herded under a railroad bridge by U.S. troops from the 7th Cavalry Regiment. Over several days, soldiers opened fire with machine guns and aircraft strafed the area. Survivors later described bodies piled in the tunnels, children crying beneath corpses, people shot as they tried to drink from the river. Estimates of the dead range from 200 to more than 300. For decades, the U.S. Army denied that its troops committed any massacre, suggesting the stories were communist propaganda. Only in the late 1990s, after an Associated Press investigation uncovered documents and veteran testimony confirming orders to fire on refugees, did the Pentagon conduct an inquiry. The official report expressed regret but denied deliberate wrongdoing, blaming confusion of war. The victims' families received no formal apology and no compensation. 71. Operation Northwoods. In the early 1960s, top Pentagon officials drafted a plan that reads like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream, except it's real. Codenamed Operation Northwoods, it proposed staging fake terrorist attacks to justify a U.S. invasion of Cuba. The ideas were shockingly specific: hijack or fake the shooting down of civilian airliners, blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay, stage bombings in Miami and Washington, even manufacture a campaign of Cuban terror with planted evidence. The plan suggested using fake funerals and planted stories to sway public opinion. All of it would be blamed on Fidel Castro, to create a pretext for war. The Joint Chiefs of Staff unanimously approved the proposal in 1962 and sent it to Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. President Kennedy rejected it, and Northwoods was shelved. Declassified documents released in the 1990s confirmed how close the U.S. military came to endorsing domestic false flag operations. Textbooks usually say the U.S. considered different options on Cuba. They rarely mention that those options included faking the deaths of American civilians. 72. The Gulf of Tonkin doubts. By 1964, Vietnam was already simmering, but Washington needed a clean justification to go all in. Enter the Gulf of Tonkin incident. On August 2, 1964, the destroyer USS Maddox reported being attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. 2 days later, a second attack was reported in bad weather and radar confusion. President Johnson went on television saying American ships had been attacked twice, unprovoked, and asked Congress for authority to respond. Congress almost unanimously passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, effectively handing him a blank check to wage war. Only later did doubts surface. NSA intercepts were misread or misrepresented. Crew members on the Maddox later said they weren't sure the second attack happened at all. Internal memos suggested officials already wanted escalation and seized on ambiguous radar blips as proof. Declassified documents show that even at the time, some in the administration suspected there had been no second attack, but the narrative had momentum. History books often describe Tonkin as controversial. They tend to skip over how a possibly phantom incident opened the door to a war that killed millions. 73. The Pentagon Papers. As Vietnam dragged on and body counts climbed, Americans were told there was light at the end of the tunnel. Inside the government, officials knew that tunnel was collapsing. In 1971, military analyst Daniel Ellsberg leaked a 7,000-page classified study of U.S. decision-making in Vietnam, quickly dubbed the Pentagon Papers. The documents showed that multiple administrations, Truman through Johnson, had secretly expanded the war while publicly promising restraint. They revealed officials privately admitted the war was unwinnable even as they sent more troops. Covert bombing in Laos and Cambodia, rigged elections in South Vietnam, deliberate lies about enemy strength, all laid out in black and white. The Nixon administration tried to stop publication, claiming national security. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the press, affirming the right to publish. The Pentagon Papers didn't end the war overnight, but they shattered trust in the government's word. Textbooks usually frame them as a landmark in press freedom. They're less eager to emphasize the core lesson: top officials knowingly lied about life and death decisions for years. 74. Operation CHAOS. While the CIA was supposed to operate overseas, the 1960s made that boundary feel inconvenient to some in Langley. As anti-war protests exploded and social movements grew, President Johnson and later Nixon wanted to know if foreign powers were pulling the strings. The CIA responded with Operation CHAOS, a secret program to spy on Americans. From 1967 to 1974, CHAOS compiled files on more than 7,000 U.S. citizens and 1,000 domestic groups, anti-war activists, civil rights leaders, student organizations, even journalists. Agents infiltrated meetings, intercepted mail, and shared data with the FBI, despite laws in the CIA's charter prohibiting domestic operations. Internal reports acknowledged they found virtually no evidence of significant foreign control. Still, the surveillance expanded. It only came to light in the 1970s when whistleblowers and journalists exposed the program, leading to investigations. Official histories mention COINTELPRO and Hoover's FBI more than CHAOS, leaving out that the Foreign Intelligence Agency also turned its tools inward on American dissent. 75. Watergate's deeper pattern. When people hear Watergate, they think of a single bungled break-in at the Democratic National Committee. But the scandal wasn't a one-off, it was the tip of a much larger iceberg. Nixon's re-election team, the committee to re-elect the president, mockingly called CREEP, ran a campaign of political sabotage. They forged documents to smear opponents, organized dirty tricks operations, and used the IRS and FBI to harass enemies. There was the burglary of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, searching for dirt to discredit him after he leaked the Pentagon Papers. There were illegal wiretaps on journalists and staffers, secret cash slush funds, and a White House plumbers unit dedicated to plugging leaks by any means. Watergate exposed not just a president who lied, but an administration that treated law enforcement and intelligence agencies as partisan weapons. Nixon resigned. A few aides went to prison, and reforms were passed. But many of the people who helped design these tactics later resurfaced in future administrations. Textbooks tend to frame Watergate as a triumph of checks and balances, less as a warning about how easily the system can be bent. 76. The Church Committee findings. After Watergate and a wave of leaks, Congress finally decided to look under the hood of America's intelligence machine. In 1975, the Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations, chaired by Senator Frank Church, began hearings that pulled back decades of secrecy. The Church Committee uncovered CIA plots to assassinate foreign leaders, including Fidel Castro and Patrice Lumumba. They revealed FBI programs like COINTELPRO, which had spied on, blackmailed, and tried to destroy civil rights organizers, anti-war activists, and even women's liberation groups. They documented NSA programs that had scooped up Americans' communications without warrants for years. The committee's reports painted a picture of intelligence agencies largely unrestrained, improvising their own missions with minimal oversight. In response, Congress created permanent intelligence committees and the FISA court to supervise surveillance. But many of the committee's recommendations were watered down or ignored. Modern textbooks might give the Church Committee a paragraph, if that. They rarely dwell on its central message. Unchecked secret power will be abused, and it was, repeatedly. 77. The Iran-Contra affair. By the 1980s, the lesson from all those investigations should have been clear. Secret wars and side deals end badly. The Reagan administration decided to try anyway. Congress had banned direct military aid to the Contras, a right-wing rebel group in Nicaragua accused of atrocities. At the same time, Iran was under an arms embargo. Officials in the White House came up with a workaround: secretly sell weapons to Iran, then funnel some of the money to the Contras. The plan violated both U.S. law and stated policy of not negotiating with terrorists, since part of the goal was to secure the release of American hostages in Lebanon. L.T. Cole, Oliver North, and others ran the network through off-the-books accounts and front companies. When a supply plane was shot down and a Lebanese magazine exposed the arms sales, the scheme unraveled. Investigations found shredded documents, evasive testimony, and a president who claimed not to recall key details. Several officials were convicted, then later had their sentences commuted or were pardoned by President George H.W. Bush. Textbooks sometimes call Iran-Contra a constitutional crisis, but often gloss over how it showed a willingness to ignore Congress, lie to the public, and run private foreign policy from the basement. 78. The business plot. In 1934, retired Marine General Smedley Butler testified before Congress that a group of wealthy businessmen had approached him with a proposal: lead a veterans army to Washington, depose Franklin Roosevelt, and install a corporate-friendly Secretary of General Affairs while leaving FDR as a ceremonial figurehead. Butler named names: Wall Street brokers, executives connected to DuPont and JP Morgan interests, leaders of big business associations. The idea, he said, was modeled on Mussolini's Italy, a soft fascist takeover to block the New Deal. A congressional committee quietly confirmed much of his story, then buried the report. No one was prosecuted. Textbooks usually mention the Great Depression, the New Deal, and rising fascism overseas, but they rarely mention that American elites seriously toyed with importing fascism at home. 79. The Black Wall Street insurance denials. When white mobs burned Tulsa's Greenwood district in 1921, they weren't just attacking homes, they were destroying one of the wealthiest black communities in America. After the massacre, survivors did what you're told to do in a civilized society. They filed insurance claims. Companies responded with technicalities and fine print. Many policies had riot clauses or exclusions for insurrection, so insurers declared the destruction an uninsurable riot and refused to pay. An estimated 1,200 homes and dozens of businesses were wiped out. The vast majority received no compensation. City officials also blocked lawsuits and rewrote zoning laws to make rebuilding harder. Generations of black wealth vanished in a weekend and was never restored. School lessons might briefly mention racial tensions in Tulsa. They almost never mention that the financial system helped make sure the victims stayed poor. 80. Redlining maps. In the 1930s, the federal government wanted to stabilize home lending, so the Homeowners Loan Corporation drew up color-coded maps of cities rating neighborhoods for mortgage risk. Areas with black or immigrant residents were almost automatically outlined in red, hazardous, regardless of income or individual creditworthiness. Banks and the Federal Housing Administration then refused to back loans in those red zones, starving them of investment. Meanwhile, white suburbs were marked green and showered with federally supported mortgages. Over decades, this meant white families could buy homes, build equity, and pass wealth to their children, while black families were locked out or pushed into predatory contracts. The effects still show up in property values, school funding, and health outcomes today. Textbooks might mention housing discrimination in a sentence. They usually skip that the federal government literally mapped where wealth would and wouldn't grow. 81. Urban renewal displacement. In the 1950s and 60s, politicians sold urban renewal as modernization, new highways, civic centers, and gleaming towers to replace blight. On paper, it sounded like progress. In practice, it often meant bulldozing black neighborhoods and working-class communities of color. Planners routed interstate highways straight through thriving districts, cutting them off from downtowns and each other. Cities used eminent domain to condemn homes and businesses, offering lowball payments or none at all. Residents were promised better housing that often never materialized. Iconic black neighborhoods from Detroit's Black Bottom to New Orleans' Treme were gutted or erased. Sociologists nicknamed urban renewal Negro removal for a reason. Official histories might praise the interstate system and post-war growth, skipping over the families whose houses became someone else's exit ramp. 82. Sundown towns. For much of the 20th century, thousands of American towns and suburbs enforced an unwritten but deadly rule. If you weren't white, you had to be gone by sunset. Some posted blunt signs at the city limits. N. Don't let the sun set on you here. Others relied on police harassment, mob violence, or word-of-mouth terror. Black travelers learned to plan carefully, using guides like the Negro Motorist Green Book to find safe places to eat, sleep, and buy gas. Many of these towns passed no explicit segregation laws. Their exclusion was enforced socially and violently, which made it easier to deny later. Census records show entire counties with virtually no black residents in regions where black people had lived for generations. School books might talk about Jim Crow in the South. They often ignore that sundown towns stretched across the Midwest, West, and North, quietly walling off entire communities. 83. The GI Bill's unequal access. After World War II, the GI Bill is often celebrated as the law that built the American middle class: tuition for college, low-cost home loans, unemployment support for returning veterans. On paper, it was race neutral. In reality, local control and discrimination meant black veterans rarely got the same benefits. Southern colleges refused to admit them, and historically black colleges were underfunded and overcrowded, turning many applicants away. Banks and local VA offices in segregated areas denied or slow-walked home loans for black GIs, especially in white neighborhoods and suburbs where property values would rise. In some counties, almost no black veterans received mortgages at all. White veterans used the bill to buy homes in redline-free suburbs and accumulate equity. Black veterans were often left renting in declining urban areas. Textbooks praise the GI Bill as a social miracle. They rarely say clearly that its unequal implementation baked racial wealth gaps into the post-war economy. 84. The convict leasing system. When the Civil War ended and slavery was formally abolished, Southern states quickly found a workaround. They passed black codes and vagrancy laws that made it easy to arrest black people for trivial or fabricated offenses, loitering, insolence, not having proof of employment. Once convicted, prisoners were leased out to private companies and plantations to work in mines, turpentine camps, railroads, and fields. States collected fees. Businesses got cheap, disposable labor. Conditions were often worse than slavery. No incentive to keep workers alive. Rampant beatings, starvation, and disease. Thousands died unnamed. This system lasted from the late 1800s well into the 20th century, underpinning Southern industrial growth. The 13th Amendment's exception clause allowing involuntary servitude as a punishment for crime made it technically legal. Textbooks usually say slavery ended in 1865 and move on. They tend not to dwell on how the criminal justice system became a pipeline back into forced labor. 85. Peonage in the New South. After the Civil War, white landowners in the South reinvented control without calling it slavery. They used sharecropping contracts, company stores, and local sheriffs to trap black laborers and poor whites in endless debt. If a worker tried to leave before repaying, what was often an invented or inflated balance, they could be arrested for breaking contract or vagrancy. Judges would find them, then hire out their labor to the same planters or nearby businesses to work off the debt. Federal law technically banned peonage, but enforcement was weak, and local officials were in on it. People were whipped, chained, and forced to work in fields, lumber camps, and turpentine camps under threat of jail or violence. This system lasted deep into the 20th century. Textbooks usually jump from slavery to sharecropping as if it were just an economic arrangement, glossing over how debt bondage kept forced labor alive. 86. The Memphis Sanitation Strike. In 1968, black sanitation workers in Memphis were paid starvation wages to do dangerous work white workers refused. 2 men had been crushed to death in a malfunctioning garbage truck. Routine neglect, not a freak accident. When the city refused to improve conditions or recognize their union, 1,300 workers went on strike, carrying simple, devastating signs. I am a man. They were asserting basic humanity in a city that treated them as disposable. Police beat marchers and used mace on peaceful protesters. Martin Luther King Jr. came to support them, tying economic justice to civil rights in his final campaign. He delivered his "I've been to the mountaintop" speech in Memphis, then was assassinated the next day. The strike eventually won raises and union recognition, but school lessons often frame King's last days as abstract civil rights work, not as solidarity with low-wage black workers demanding dignified labor and pay. 87. The 1863 New York Draft Riots. In July 1863, as the Civil War raged, the Union government introduced a draft that let the wealthy buy their way out for $300. Working-class white New Yorkers, many Irish immigrants, saw it as a war fought for the benefit of the rich and for black freedom that might threaten their jobs. Protests exploded into a 4-day race riot. Mobs burned the colored orphan asylum, lynched black men in the streets, and attacked anyone who looked sympathetic to abolition. Police were overwhelmed. Troops fresh from the Battle of Gettysburg had to restore order. Hundreds were killed or injured, many of them black residents who had nothing to do with the draft. Textbooks might mention the riots in a line about resistance to conscription, but rarely emphasize that the anger was channeled into racial terror against a vulnerable minority community. 88. The Anti-Rent Wars. In the mid-1800s, upstate New York still operated under a leftover quasi-feudal system from Dutch colonial days. Wealthy families like the Van Rensselaers owned vast estates. Tenant farmers paid rent in cash, wheat and livestock, with little chance to ever own the land they worked. When landlords tried to enforce back rents and evictions during bad harvests, tenants rebelled. They formed secret societies, disguised themselves in colorful calico Indian costumes, and disrupted sheriff's auctions, sometimes by force. Clashes with authorities turned deadly. The movement pushed for an end to perpetual leases and for the breakup of these landed estates. Eventually, New York amended its constitution to curb feudal-style landholding, and many tenants gained ownership. In most school narratives, the state is portrayed as a land of independent yeoman farmers. The anti-rent wars, where people literally fought to escape a semi-feudal system, rarely make the cut. 89. The Dorr Rebellion. In the 1840s, Rhode Island was still using a colonial-era charter that limited voting to property-owning men, excluding most workers and immigrants. Reformers led by Thomas Dorr argued that government should rest on the consent of the governed, not a narrow class of landowners. When the legislature refused to expand suffrage, they held their own People's Convention, drafted a new constitution, and held a rival election. For a brief moment, Rhode Island had two competing governments claiming legitimacy. The charter government called in federal troops and declared martial law. Dorr's followers staged a failed attack on an arsenal, and he was later convicted of treason and imprisoned. Eventually, the state quietly adopted many of the reforms he'd demanded, expanding the vote. Civics lessons praise the steady march of democracy but tend to skip the part where ordinary people literally rebelled for the right to vote. 90. The Reconstruction Massacre of New Orleans. In July 1866, black and white delegates gathered at the Mechanics' Institute in New Orleans to push for black voting rights and a new state constitution. Outside, white supremacist police officers, ex-Confederates, and armed mobs were already seething. When the convention reconvened, the mob attacked. Police joined in, firing on unarmed delegates and black bystanders. Men were shot, beaten, and stabbed in the streets. Wounded people were executed where they lay. Estimates vary, but dozens of black men and several white allies were murdered, with many more wounded. A congressional committee later called it a massacre, not a riot, and used it as evidence to justify harsher Reconstruction policies. Yet schoolbooks often treat Reconstruction violence as scattered racial clashes, not organized efforts by local authorities and white mobs to crush black political power with bullets. 91. The Utah Massacre. In October 1870, during an election in Utah, Alabama, black voters, many of them formerly enslaved, lined up determined to exercise their new rights. White Democrats, eager to retake control from Reconstruction governments, organized armed clubs and rifle societies to intimidate them. Tensions escalated when black Republicans held a rally. White gunmen attacked, shooting into the crowd, chasing people through the streets, and killing black men who tried to flee or hide. Dozens were killed or wounded. Almost no white attackers faced consequences. The violence sent a clear message. Voting could get you killed. Incidents like Utah helped suppress black turnout and paved the way for Jim Crow. In many textbooks, Reconstruction's collapse is blamed on corruption or Northern fatigue. The deliberate campaigns of terror aimed at black voters, including massacres like Utah, are often reduced to footnotes or not mentioned at all. 92. The Mississippi Plan. After federal troops left the South, white Democrats in Mississippi didn't just hope black voters would disappear. They built a system to make it happen. The Mississippi Plan of 1875 was a coordinated campaign. Paramilitary rifle clubs, intimidation at polling places, beatings, murders, economic pressure on anyone who dared vote Republican. Newspapers openly called for bulldozing black voters. Federal authorities mostly looked the other way. The plan worked. Black turnout collapsed. White Democrats retook the state, and their blueprint was copied across the South. Later, poll taxes and literacy tests finished the job. Textbooks talk about Redeemer governments returning, but not about the organized terror that made democracy impossible. 93. The Immortal 10 at Texas Southern. In 1960, 10 students at Texas Southern University in Houston decided to test segregation the quiet way. They sat at a whites-only lunch counter and waited. No violence, no threats, just calm defiance. Police arrested them and charged them with unlawful assembly, treating peaceful students like criminals for ordering food in the wrong place. Their case dragged on as local officials tried to make an example of them. The Immortal 10, as they came to be called, helped push desegregation in Houston without national cameras or dramatic speeches. Their story shows how many civil rights heroes were young, unknown, and faced arrest simply for sitting down politely in the wrong chair. 94. The Delano Grape Strike. In 1965, farm workers in California's Central Valley were paid pennies to pick grapes from sunrise to sunset. Most were Filipino workers who'd been exploited for decades. Led by Larry Itlayong, they walked off the fields in Delano, launching a strike against powerful growers. They asked Mexican-American workers to join them. A few weeks later, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta brought their union in, and the movement became multiracial. They organized boycotts, marches, and years of nonviolent pressure. Eventually, they won contracts, better wages, and national attention. School stories often start with Chavez, skipping the Filipino workers who sparked the strike and turned dinner table grapes into a symbol of labor justice. 95. The Watsonville Riots. In 1930, in Watsonville, California, white residents suddenly decided Filipino farm workers were a threat. Newspapers whipped up panic about race mixing because Filipino men danced with white women at local halls. For nights, white mobs roamed the streets, dragging Filipino workers from bunkhouses, beating them, and firing into buildings. One young Filipino man was killed. Many were injured. Homes were destroyed. Authorities made a few token arrests, but largely blamed the victims. Instead of confronting racism, the government responded by tightening immigration restrictions on Asians. History classes may mention anti-Asian exclusion laws in broad strokes, but they rarely connect them to real people terrorized in places like Watsonville. 96. The Bellingham Riots. In 1907, in Bellingham, Washington, South Asian men, mostly Sikh lumber workers from British India, took jobs in local mills. White workers, stirred up by racist unions and newspapers, claimed they were invading. One night, hundreds of white men formed a mob, stormed boarding houses, beat South Asian workers, and herded them into the city jail for their own protection. Within days, virtually every South Asian laborer had been driven out of town. Similar riots erupted up and down the West Coast. The federal government's response was not to protect the victims, but to negotiate with Britain to restrict Indian migration. The story shows how white mobs could redraw the racial map with almost no consequences. 97. The destruction of Seneca Village. Before Central Park was a postcard, the land in the middle of Manhattan was home to real people. Seneca Village was a thriving black and immigrant community in the 1800s, with churches, schools, and landowning black families. Property ownership there even allowed some black men to vote in New York's restricted system. When elites decided the city needed a grand park, they labeled the residents squatters and shanty dwellers. The city used eminent domain to seize the land, underpaid the owners, and forcibly evicted everyone. Houses and institutions were demolished to make way for lawns and walking paths. Tour guides now point out scenic spots where a black community's history was literally buried under landscaping. 98. The Hawaiian language ban in schools. After American-backed businessmen overthrew the Hawaiian monarchy in 1893, they didn't just seize land and power. They went after language. In 1896, the new government banned Hawaiian as a medium of instruction in schools. Children were forced to learn in English. Many were punished, shamed, or beaten for speaking Hawaiian in class or on the playground. Within a few generations, the number of native speakers collapsed. The ban wasn't lifted until the late 20th century, after huge cultural damage. Today, immersion schools and language programs struggle to revive what a policy of forced English almost killed. Textbooks often frame the annexation of Hawaii as strategic or inevitable, rarely mentioning that it included an attempted erasure of an entire language and worldview. 99. The Freedom Riders' federal frustration. By 1961, the Supreme Court had already ruled that interstate buses and terminals couldn't be segregated. On paper, black and white passengers should have been able to sit, ride, and use facilities equally when crossing state lines. In reality, southern states just ignored those decisions, and the federal government mostly let them. So, integrated groups of activists called Freedom Riders boarded buses to test the rulings. They were met with mobs, beatings, firebombed buses, and police who either joined in or stood aside. When riders were arrested in Mississippi, federal officials worried more about embarrassment than justice. The Kennedy administration quietly pressured them to pause the rides rather than immediately enforcing the law. Only after brutal images and international condemnation did the federal government finally order the Interstate Commerce Commission to issue clear rules and actually enforce desegregation. Your textbook might mention the Freedom Riders as brave activists, but usually glosses over how long Washington watched them bleed before acting.